right? All right, well, I'll start by saying good morning and thank you for having me here today. My name is Laura Meier and I'm a graduate student in the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota, following the program's Archaeological Heritage track. Today I'm presenting fascinating archaeology, research, and documentation of the Fort Snelling button type collection. And throughout this presentation, I recount my contribution as an intern with the Minnesota Historical Society Archaeology Department, specifically with their collections. And I'll start by giving a brief background to the overall project and then my role in documenting the collection in particular. I'll then go into greater depth about some of the manufacturing history into two material types in particular, bone and shell, before going into some other avenues of interpretation that could come from this history. So to provide some context, my internship was but one part of a larger project, which Steve Goranson talked about yesterday, so I'd encourage looking at his talk, which was started in 2019, basically when MNHS transferred their collections from Fort Snelling to the Kellogg Center. And among these collections was the Historical Archaeology Comparative Collection, which at this time they decided to digitize, upload to collections online, and to a separate digital resource, which is now in the making. And this is ultimately to increase visibility and accessibility. And in last semesters, when I joined this project as an intern for the fall of 2020, and my focus was primarily on writing more robust artifact descriptions to prepare the records for upload, and also to write historical narratives that could accompany and contextualize the collection. However, given the breadth of the project, I ended up focusing on one material in particular, and that was the button type collection. And there are two reasons for this. One being that it's fairly well represented within the collection, but had not yet been researched or documented very well. And secondly, just because it was during the pandemic, I needed to be able to work remotely. And so there was some already physical documents that had been digitized, as well as some photographs as well, which helped me out a lot. Note that I'll use these photographs throughout the presentation. They're not the final ones that will be for upload, so just take note of that. This is an example on the right of one of these physical documents as well. So in this process, I started first by cross-referencing the type numbers to the catalog numbers and digital records in the collections management system, so an EMU. So for example, this picture here is type A6. I then referenced any existing artifact descriptions that were out there, although most of them were quite small, before updating them. And in each of these, I tried to include any physical description, so shape, material, attachment type, so whether it was sew through or a shank button, for instance, and any decoration if that was applicable. I tried to give any sort of sense of a possible function and date range, although I know some of you may know that that can be very difficult with this material, but I'll talk about that later. And then any measurements and the building and year from which it was excavated at Fort Snelling. Writing these descriptions, though, required research into the history and production of the material types represented, of which I primarily focused on two, as I mentioned, bone and shell, or pearl as it's sometimes referred, which I'll present in addition to some diagnostic attributes that might help in identification. So when compared to other material types, bone buttons are regarded as the oldest, most common, and simplest to make. Note that this is also noted of, or said of, wood buttons, but those won't preserve as well. By the 17th and 18th centuries, wood became the staple, quote unquote, utilitarian button material, a major reason being that it was just prevalent and able to be made inexpensively within the home with just a funnel long bone and a lathe or carpenter's brace and bit. And as I've noted here, cow and pig shin bones were most common and provided a conveniently flat surface. They were soaked to soften before being cut lengthwise into a flattened slab. Then at this point, any bone marrow or spongy bone would be removed, and then a lathe would cut these circular blanks. Most often, they resulted in 2 or 4 hole sew-throughs, so ones that could be fastened to a piece of clothing with thread, for example, and were rather small and very often associated with fastening our undergarments. Remnants of this process that you can see pictured here can be found at archaeological sites, as can the larger bone slabs left over with those negatives, and they can be strong indicators of bone button production. And though I mentioned that most of them fit that 2 or 4 hole category, there are exceptions and they can be quite telling. 5 hole buttons, for instance, are a product of earlier lathe manufacture, whereby the lathe pierced a central hole in the disc during production. The surrounding 4 holes would then be drilled by hand, which is why they often appear asymmetrical in position and size, as you can see in this type right here, Bay 15. By 1790, though, a machine was invented which could simultaneously drill these holes during the lathing stage, which eliminated this central hole. And in effect, these 5 hole buttons diminished into the 19th century, while those evenly spaced 4 hole ones became more increasingly common. Lathe manufactured buttons, too, you can note, will often include this simple ring design that you can see on the front. You could call it a design. It's basically imparted by the lathe that's holding the blank in place. And that can be on those which may have hand drilled holes or not. Adversely, blanks can also just be used as is, and they could have been, for example, finished with a shank or a nail head, and oftentimes would have been cloth covered. This cloth often will not accompany or preserve this blank, so this might be all that's left over. And also, they could have sometimes been the back to a 2-part button or a metal button, and oftentimes that'll be separated from that metal counterpart. Sometimes it can be indicated, or the presence of metal in the past can be indicated by an indentation on the back around the edge, although I don't believe this to be an example of that. So unfortunately, as some of you may know, apart from indicators of lathe production, bone buttons vary little through time in comparison to other materials. And this can make it difficult to ascertain not only its function, but also any date range. What can be gleaned, though, is generally extrapolated from a button size. The vast majority being small or being associated with undergarments, as I said, which would fit this, utilitarian topic here, although I kind of shy away from using that term myself. But they could have been used to fasten any lighter clothing, such as shirts, pants, waistcoats, as noted here, as well as dresses. And in fact, most buttons could have been used to fasten any number of these garments, as they were often repurposed, which also does not necessarily help us in terms of aging, but it is interesting nonetheless. This is true of larger bone buttons as well, and although they're less common, they would generally be found on coats or jackets, with the general trend being the larger the button, the heavier the piece of clothing that it fastened. Additionally, even though bone buttons are still made today, by the 1850s, their production reduced considerably, and this was mainly to the introduction of vegetable ivory or horn, which became an inexpensive, easily treatable alternative. And then later by the freshwater pearl industry that I'll get more into in depth. And with this mass production in the pearl industry, there became standardized measurements for specific pieces of clothing that you can see here. And this measurement was known as a line, derived from the French ligne that you see written, 40 of which would be equal to 1 inch that you can see here. Now, given Minnesota's proximity to a plethora of waterways, the production history of shell buttons does hit close to home. However, the industry did not reach the US until the late 19th century. And in fact, prior to 1890, the majority of pearl buttons, or specifically marine or mother of pearl, as they're sometimes referred, were imported from Europe. Although some American coastal cities, such as New York and Philadelphia, partook in the production with some success. And by 1880, the industry also attempted to expand inland with examples even in Cincinnati, and one mention of being even here in St. Paul, Minnesota. But they were met with little success as the buttons were still quite expensive and therefore outworn by those cheaper alternatives. And this remained the case until that 1890 mark, and that was with the McKinley tariff. And this was important because it reduced shell button imports considerably and allowed John Buckley, a German immigrant and a button maker, to take advantage of the emerging market. And interestingly, before he immigrated, he actually had imported shells from the Illinois River and was aware of their potential. And therefore, he came back to the Midwest and set up roots in Muscatine, Iowa, and was able to adapt ocean pearl button machinery to accommodate harder freshwater shells, which had been the barrier for most prior to this. After this, shells would actually have been collected from up and down the Mississippi River Basin and its peripheries, with Minnesota rivers being no exception, with the St. Croix, the Minnesota, and a number of other lakes playing a role in the industry. And in fact, by 1911, a number of factories were operating within the state of Minnesota. Perhaps one of the most well-known was that of present-day Lake City, previously known as Shell City, which opened in the mid-1890s. It was located on Lake Pepin, and its shells were desired for their nacreous, or also known as iridescent kind of look, and also a smooth exterior, which resulted in less waste during the manufacturing process. However, its location lacked the ability to transport large amounts of shells, which encouraged Shell City and other places within the state to open what were known as sawworks, where after mussels would be soaked and meat removed, blanks would be cut from the shells, and then these blanks would be shipped by train car to finishing plants like those in Muscatine, where they would sustain treatment. And this system proved successful for several decades, and Lake Pepin actually recorded 21 40-ton carloads from the upper lake in 1924. Though not as successful, other factories operating out of Pine and Crow Wing counties, for example, soon opened sawworks of their own, such as Peterson's factory, which ran from 1900 to 1910 on Pokegama Lake in Pine City. Here and throughout the state, shell button production was a natural extension to an already popular mussel culture, whereby locals caught mussels in search for valuable pearls and would also save the meat sometimes for, say, pig or chicken feed. The remnants of used shells, which sometimes exhibit those negative blanks, can be found at archaeological sites and are obvious indicators of button production at archaeological sites, along sometimes with the foundation of a small building nearby. Within a few decades, though, mussel populations depleted significantly throughout the country. And paired with the rising competition of the Japanese pearl button market and the effects of the Great Depression, the industry virtually disappeared by 1950. And these factors, I believe, lead us to larger historical questions and stories that some which have present resident effects, to which these artifacts are but one testament. And here on the right, you can see this figure where you can see the difference in cost between, say, different blanks from Japan versus the US. And on top, you can see the different measurements. So 16L, meaning 16 lines, so that standardized measurement. So looking beyond buttons, as I say, so even today, the diversity of mussels in the region, or of mollusks in the region, is around half that of the early 1900s. And according to the Minnesota DNR, 28 out of 50 of Minnesota's native mussel species are endangered, threatened, or of special concern today, specifically due to invasive species and pollution especially. This story then can serve as a firsthand example of the dangers of natural resource extraction, an ever relevant subject as we witness mass extinctions for a variety of reasons, pollution and global warming being two. Pictured is a photograph from Clayton's work depicting but one attempt in the struggle to rid of the insurmountable amount of waste during that time period. Looking to decoration, carved marine and freshwater pearl buttons can be an indicator of gender wealth and social standing. Decorated marine pearl buttons, like the one you saw earlier, for instance, served as a decorative piece on women's clothing prior to 15, and again as a functional and decorative fastener after the 1860s. These required more labor than their plain counterparts and therefore represented a more expensive alternative. But they were not unique in that they were also repurposed, especially since they were so expensive. And so sometimes would be repurposed on clothes of lesser means, with accounts of enslaved peoples wearing these fancier buttons of their wealthier owners in southern plantations. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. This story provides an opportunity to dive into labor history and activism within our region. Many accounts from Iowa and Wisconsin recount the dangerous conditions for factory workers, with this picture here from Muscatine, again from Clayton's work, and especially for the women who would wash and decorate the buttons, in addition to children. In such conditions, paired with unfair wages, led to many union strikes as workers demanded better compensation and a safer work environment and proper legislation for themselves. All right, I'd like to say thank you as I finish up today to the Council for Minnesota Archaeology and Minnesota Historical Society for hosting today. And a special thank you to my supervisor, Nancy Hoffman, as well as Jennifer Rankin and Steve Goranson, and also the Heritage Studies and Public History program, including my advisor, Kat Hayes at the U of M. If anybody has any questions, I've left my contact information here. If you'd like a copy of any paper or references, I'd be happy to, but I'm also happy to answer any questions here if we have time.